Welcome to Beyond the Veil, the channel that unveils the mysteries hidden between myth, history, and legend. Here, we explore what lies behind the stories that have passed through the centuries, because every myth has a grain of truth. If you too are fascinated by the unknown, subscribe and get ready to look beyond the veil of reality. Imagine walking alone on a moonless night. The air is cold, the silence unnatural, and you feel as if you're being watched. Then a sudden noise, a whisper in the wind, shadows moving faster than they should. What if vampires weren't just a legend? For centuries, humanity has been obsessed with these creatures of the night. Their allure is universal. From visceral terror to hypnotic seduction, vampires have traversed eras and cultures, evolving from bloodthirsty monsters to pop culture icons. But what makes them so irresistible? Is it the fear of death, the idea of immortality, or perhaps the thrill of the forbidden, the predator among us? From ancient myths to the Gothic pages of Bram Stoker, to the neon lights of Hollywood, vampires have transformed, adapting to time and society. But behind the stories, the films and the novels, there lies something deeper. A shadow that stretches across the centuries, between superstition, fear, and perhaps some unsettling truth. In this video, we will explore the dark origins of vampires, historical cases of vampirism, their evolution from monsters to fascinating figures, and even the scientific side behind the myth. And in the end, we'll answer the question we all ask: could vampires really exist? But first, who was the first vampire in history? The answer may surprise you. Vampires are not a modern invention. Long before films, books, and TV shows, there were already legends about dark creatures that fed on the life of humans. But where does the myth of the vampire originate? Its roots go back to ancient times, well before Dracula and Gothic stories. The earliest accounts of vampire-like beings come from Mesopotamia, one of the oldest civilizations in history. Here, there were tales of Lilitu, a malevolent female spirit said to fly through the night to feed on infants and sleeping men. This figure later evolved into Lilith, present in Jewish folklore and often associated with vampirism. But Mesopotamia is not the only place where the myth of life-thirsty creatures takes shape. In India, stories tell of the Vitala, evil spirits that haunted corpses and would awaken to torment the living. According to the tales, these beings not only fed on the vital energy of humans, but were also able to control the bodies they possessed. One of the earliest versions of what we would now call the undead. But it is in Eastern Europe that we perhaps find the most direct roots of the modern vampire. In Romania, there were tales of the strigoi, beings that rose from their graves to feed on the blood of the living. Popular belief held that some people were destined to become strigoi after death, especially if they had led a cursed life, died violently, or had not been properly buried. For this reason, bodies were often exhumed and subjected to macabre rituals to prevent them from becoming bloodthirsty creatures. These legends reveal an ancient fear of humanity, the fear of death, and most of all, the fear that the dead might return. During the Middle Ages, to protect themselves from the possible return of the deceased, many people were buried with their faces facing down, to prevent them from rising from the grave. In some cases, corpses were found with bricks stuffed in their mouths or wooden stakes in their chests, a sign of a deep-rooted terror in the society of the time. But how did we move from these tales of popular terror to the fascinating and seductive vampires of modern culture? To find out, we must delve into the first documented vampire hunts in history, and the legend of the man who inspired Dracula. The fear of vampires has not just been a legend told around the campfire. For centuries, humanity has actually believed in the existence of these creatures and has even conducted actual vampire hunts, often with brutal consequences. Stories of the undead feeding on the blood of the living have driven entire communities to exhume corpses, perform macabre rituals, and take extreme measures to prevent the return of the dead. In Eastern Europe, where vampire folklore was particularly deep, the idea that a deceased person could return to life was taken very seriously. During the 18th century, there were numerous incidents in which bodies were dug up and subjected to strange rites. Some were decapitated. Others had their hearts pierced with a wooden pallet, and in some cases the corpse was even burned to ward off danger. One of the most famous cases is that of Petar Blagojevich, a Serbian peasant who died in 1725. After his death, several villagers began to die suddenly, and his family reported seeing him wandering around at night. Fear spread so quickly that Blagojevich's body was exhumed and found unusually well preserved, with fresh blood on his mouth. This was enough to convince the terrified crowd to impale the corpse and burn it. Vampire panic also existed in Victorian England, albeit less brutally. A well-known case is that of the Brown family in Rhode Island in the late 19th century. After several members of the family died of tuberculosis, the belief spread that one of them was sucking the life of living relatives. The body of Mercy Brown, one of the victims, was exhumed, and her heart was burned in a ritual to stop the curse. But no figure is more associated with vampirism than Vlad Tepes, the bloodthirsty prince of Wallachia, also known as Vlad the Impaler. His cruelty was legendary. He was said to have his enemies impaled and left their rotting bodies as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge him. He was also said to have feasted on corpses and had an almost ritualistic taste for violence. Although there is no evidence that he drank blood, his reputation inspired Bram Stoker, who in 1897 wrote the famous Dracula, creating the most iconic vampire in history. These episodes show us how the fear of vampires was something deeply real for many people. And while folklore fueled panic, literature and cinema were in the process of transforming the vampire from a terrifying monster to a pop culture icon. But how did this change happen? To find out, we must enter the world of Gothic and cinematic horror. Vampires have not always been the fascinating and seductive creatures we know today. Once, they were horrific monsters, true walking nightmares, symbols of death and corruption. But over time, something changed. The vampire transitioned from being a grotesque, bloodthirsty creature to a dark icon of elegance and mystery. But how did this transformation happen? It all took a turn with Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. Before that, stories about vampires were fragmented, tied to folklore and local legends. But Stoker gave them a new identity. His Count Dracula was not just a predator, but a sophisticated aristocrat, capable of enchanting his victims with a hypnotic gaze. He was cruel, yes, but also fascinating, a perfect balance between monster and gentleman. This change laid the foundation for all the vampires that would come afterward. Then came cinema. Nosferatu, the first major vampire film, still portrayed the classic figure of the monster. Count Orlok, with his skeletal fingers and sharp teeth, looked more like a rat than a man. But the charm of the aristocratic vampire quickly made its way to the big screen. In the 1930s, Bela Lugosi made Dracula a cinema horror icon. His accent, hypnotic gaze, and black cape solidified in the collective imagination the image of the charming and deadly vampire. Then came the 1950s and 1960s, with Christopher Lee, the most charismatic and unsettling Dracula ever seen. With his imposing stature and deep voice, he made the vampire even more seductive and dangerous. This set the stage for the 1970s and 1980s, where the vampire began to evolve into something even more complex. The definitive turning point came with Anne Rice's novel Interview with the Vampire, and its 1994 film adaptation. Here, for the first time, the vampire was not only the monster, but also the victim of its own fate. Lestat and Louis were immortal, but tormented, cursed by an eternal life that condemned them to an existence of desire and suffering. This forever changed the way we see vampires. No longer just predators, but romantic, tragic, and melancholic creatures. And then, of course, came Twilight. Stephenie Meyer's saga completely revolutionized the image of the vampire, transforming it from a nocturnal hunter to a tortured hero, an immortal lover capable of forsaking human blood for love. Edward Cullen is no longer a creature of the night, but a protector, a shadow living among humans without harming them. From bloodthirsty monsters to immortal aristocrats, vampires have undergone an extraordinary evolution. Yet, one question remains. Is there a scientific explanation behind the myth? Is there something real in the concept of the vampire? To find out, we need to take a closer look at the science behind the myth. Vampires have always been considered legendary creatures, but what if the myth had roots in reality? Do people really exist who drink blood? And are there scientific explanations that could justify some of the characteristics attributed to vampires? Let's start with a real and rather unsettling phenomenon, real vampirism. There are individuals who identify as vampires and claim to have a physical or psychological need to consume human blood. Some practice sanguinism, which means drinking small amounts of blood from willing donors, while others claim to feed on the energy of people rather than their blood, a belief closer to psychic vampirism. From a scientific perspective, there is no evidence that drinking human blood provides any real benefits. In fact, it can be dangerous due to the risk of infections and the toxicity of excess iron. But if we dig deeper, we find that some real diseases might have given rise to the vampire legend. One of the most discussed is porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, skin problems, and, in severe cases, facial deformities and receding gums, which make the teeth appear more prominent, almost like fangs. In medieval Europe, those who suffered from this condition tended to avoid sunlight and might appear pale and elusive, thus fueling the myth of the vampire. Another possible explanation is rabies. This virus attacks the nervous system, causing spasms, aggression, and hypersensitivity to light and water. Moreover, rabies can be transmitted through bites, just like vampirism. Some scholars have hypothesized that past rabies epidemics may have contributed to the fear of creatures of the night, especially when infected individuals exhibited aggressive and uncontrollable behavior. And then there are the real vampires of nature. Vampire bats, which feed exclusively on blood and use a natural anticoagulant to prevent the wound from closing. Some species of parasites, like leeches and mosquitoes, also live entirely off the blood of other creatures. Perhaps the horror of the vampire comes from this primal fear of being consumed by another living being. So, the vampire myth may have originated from a combination of real diseases, natural phenomena, and popular beliefs. But if one day science were able to create an immortal being capable of regeneration, could we witness the birth of the true vampire? If one night you found yourself face to face with a vampire, would you know how to defend yourself? In stories and movies, there are countless ways to repel these creatures of the night. Garlic, crosses, wooden stakes. But which of these would really work, and which are just myths fueled by folklore? Let's start with garlic, one of the most famous remedies against vampires. Its origin lies in European folk beliefs, where it was thought that its pungent smell could repel evil spirits and dark creatures. Some believe that this idea might come from garlic's antiseptic properties, as it was once used to protect against diseases. But if a vampire were real, Would garlic really be a threat? Probably not, unless it had a severe allergy. And the cross? In Christian folklore, the vampire is often seen as a cursed creature, a kind of damned being fleeing from divine light. According to legend, a cross brandished with faith should be enough to repel it. But this assumes that the vampire actually has a mystical weakness or is connected to a religious concept. In a purely scientific context, the cross would have no effect unless the vampire were extremely superstitious. Now, let's talk about the most iconic weapon, the wooden stake through the heart. This is one of the few solutions that might make logical sense. The heart is a vital organ, and piercing it, regardless of the material of the weapon, would certainly be fatal for any living being. In Slavic myths, it was believed that vampires could regenerate, so the stake was used to prevent their resurrection. For safety, the body was often also decapitated or burned. But if a vampire existed in the modern world, would it really be possible to stop it? Let's assume it's a biologically advanced creature, with accelerated cellular regeneration and superhuman strength. In this case, conventional weapons like guns and blades might not be enough. A silver bullet, often associated with werewolves, could have an effect only if the vampire had a specific weakness to rare metals. And if the vampire were vulnerable to UV rays, then sunlight could really destroy it, just like in the movies. In the end, the best way to survive an encounter with a vampire is not to get caught. If the myths have a grain of truth, then the only valid advice is this: never underestimate the shadows of the night. Vampires never die, and not just in stories. For centuries, they have wandered through the pages of books, the screens of cinema, and the fantasies of humanity. But why? What makes these creatures so irresistible, so immortal in our culture? Perhaps it's because they embody our darkest desires: eternal youth, limitless power, freedom from human rules. Vampires are fascinating predators, creatures of the night who defy death and live on the fringes of the world, observing it with ancient eyes. They have evolved from being repulsive, bloodthirsty monsters to sophisticated, sexy icons, often tormented by deep melancholy. We've seen them change as mirrors of our times, from the pure horror of Nosferatu to the aristocratic elegance of Dracula, to the poignant passion of modern vampires in Twilight or Interview with the Vampire. Every era has had its own vampire, its own way of telling the eternal battle between instinct and reason, light and darkness. Vampires fascinate us because they are the perfect symbol of ambiguity, alive but dead, human but monstrous, romantic but dangerous. And every time we think their legend is over, they return, more captivating than ever. Now, I want to ask you something. If you could be a vampire, would you? Would you give up your humanity for eternity? Write it in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. And if this journey into the darkness has intrigued you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because the darkness is just beginning.